TPMNation.com.
Is this Bill Muckler?
Yes, it is.
Bill, how are you? Welcome to the show. So Bill, welcome to the show. And, your book, full disclosure, I haven't had a chance to read this yet, but 2020 Clear Vision for America. And, of course, you're also a blogger, and you've got some videos online. You have a series that's available on YouTube for people who want to check it out. And so you've got a lot going on. But can you tell us a little bit about your background? I know that you're a veteran, which I'm curious to hear about, and thank you for your service. And you're an entrepreneur. I love talking to entrepreneurs, in addition to being an author. And tell us a little bit about yourself, Bill.
Well, I grew up in St. Louis, and after high school, I graduated from high school in 1953. And the reason I bring that up is every one of us in my high school class, we went through our whole high school during the Korean War, and the Korean War was over in May of '53.
Okay.
And so we all thought we're going to Korea. And when they agreed to have the peace talks, my dad said, "Nobody in our family's ever gone to college. You're going to college." So I said, "Yes, sir," and I went to Mizzou. And the year before I graduated, I was called in for the draft, pre-induction physical. And of course, I passed all that, and I was able to get a deferment.
Yep.
And as soon as I graduated, I went to the draft board, and I said, "Hey, what's my status?" And they said, "Oh, we're glad you're here. You're number one for next month." I thought, oh, my gosh, what am I going to do now?
Yeah.
And fortunately, I was accepted into the Marine Corps officer candidate course, and I went to Quantico and went through officers boot camp.
Wow.
And got a commission and spent 4.5 years on active duty, and it was probably the best thing that ever happened to me because I met so many great people, and I learned how to do so many things, and you have to really be a critical thinker to be a leader of Marines.
Oh, no doubt about it. Now, did you say, just so I'm clear on the timeline, so the Korean War, was it winding down at that point?
No, they actually they started the peace talks in May of '53.
Right.
And for those of us that are this old, as old as I am, they actually drew a line across the Korean Peninsula on the 38th parallel, and they actually set up a building and put a big long table inside the building that on one side of the table was the North Koreans, on the other side of the table was the South Koreans and the United States and the rest of the UN. The whole UN was involved in this at that time.
Yeah.
And so they had this line drawn down the lengthwise on the middle of the table. So that's where we still are today.
Right.
Hopefully Trump can get us a little bit closer to actually declaring peace that got started in 1953.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to talk to someone who was in Korea and to get your perspective on that. I mean, how optimistic are you about that? Do you think that, full disclosure, Bill, I have a lot of, I don't know how much of the show you've heard or if you've heard any of it. I have a lot of criticisms of Trump, but I try to give him credit where I feel that it's due, and I've tried to really kind of keep an open mind on Korea and be sort of cautiously optimistic. But I'm really interested to hear how you're feeling about it, especially with the latest developments. He had to walk away during that second summit. I mean, how are you feeling about all that?
Well, Trump walking away, I think that's all just posturing, and Kim Jong-un is posturing, Trump is posturing. It's all part of the process. We don't want to give him anything too much, and he doesn't want to give us too much. And I think eventually we're going to come to something. But the good thing is he's not shooting missiles off anymore, and
right.
as long as he's not shooting missiles, there's not going to be any nukes on the tip of them. So to me, that's a good thing. And he's brought back some of our armed servicemen.
Mm-hmm.
And and he brought back Wambeer, and they kind of messed all that up the way they presented that recently. But
yeah, they did.
Yeah, he's accomplished some good things.
Hello to Jenny, who joins us in the Facebook live chat, as well as Peter White, host of the morning show here at WMNH. Yeah, the Warmbier thing, I was pretty critical on that front. But I mean, do you think that we will ultimately see, or should we see, the removal of the troops along the border there with North and South Korea entirely? I mean, is there a point at which they should all come home if things do go well into the future with Trump and Kim Jong-un, or should we maintain some troops there no matter what happens?
No, I think we should bring our troops home, but I don't think we should bring them home until we actually have a signed treaty.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And what are your views? I mean, I kind of got a little bit of a vibe of it from looking at your website, but in terms of foreign policy overall, I mean, I don't get the impression that Trump has any particular appetite to be invading anybody, although there's been some saber rattling from the administration on Venezuela. But I know that just from reading some things on your site, I mean, ultimately, I'm sure you'd like to see a future without war. But what are your views on foreign policy? I know it's kind of a broad question, but
yeah, I'm against us going into these perpetual, never-ending wars, and I've interviewed on my TV show probably a half a dozen Gold Star families, and I don't want to see the United States making any Gold Star families anymore. So
yeah, I'm with you.
But I believe that we have to have a very strong, competent military. But just so everybody understands that you're not going to be they're not going to be able to walk all over us.
Right.
Now we've got assets in 194 countries, and I think we've got assets in just about every one of them, maybe 170 or something like that. I don't have the exact number in front of me.
Yeah.
But why do we have all this around the world? It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And for example, the Russians went into Afghanistan in 1980, and they stayed there for almost 20 years, and it just about wrecked their country completely.
Yeah.
Now we've been in there 20 years, and what have we accomplished in there? Nothing. I don't see where being there is in our best interest. So I would like to see us come out of there.
Me too.
And
yeah.
We always have special forces, Marines, SEALs, Army, Rangers, and et cetera. So, we can handle, small brush fires, but I just don't see us keeping tens of thousands of troops in these foreign countries where we have really nothing to gain from it.
I feel like too, and you, you nailed it when you said, the Russians went into Afghanistan and stayed 20 years. And I worry about, that we're on that same track of, we're coming up on breaking that record eventually. And it looks like we're probably going to. And, you look at what it did to the Russians. I mean, some say, many say that that's part of what bankrupted, the Soviet Union. Now, the former Soviet Union, what was Afghanistan and that presence there. And it's like, is Afghanistan where great empires go to die ultimately? Is that ultimately going to be the demise of us? I mean, I don't necessarily think so, but hello to Christian Connarton in the Facebook live chat. And by the way, if anyone has a question or a comment or anything at all for Bill or to contribute to the conversation, feel free to chime in on Facebook. But I worry that, there's a couple things about that. For one thing, and I'm curious to get your thoughts. I talk a lot on the show about the military-industrial complex, and my theory is, not to get too conspiratorial, because I don't really operate in that zone, but I'm also conscious and aware of, I'm very cognizant of the fact that I might sound like I operate in that zone when I go down this particular road. But I feel like in terms of both Iraq and Afghanistan, they knew we were going to get bogged down. This is my theory. They knew we were going to get bogged down and that it was intentional because it helps fuel the military-industrial complex, because this is all a business. And just to throw another log on that fire, it is interesting that, I keep reading all these stories about how our main function in Afghanistan now is guarding those poppy fields, and meanwhile, and some will take that extra step and say, well, is it necessarily, I know correlation is not causation, but is there a connection with we're guarding those poppy fields and, we have this heroin crisis happening in the United States. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on that. Am I reading way too much into things? Yeah, what do you think?
I don't think you're reading too much into it. I don't think our troops over there, and I've had an opportunity to talk to many of them that have come back. I don't think they're necessarily guarding the poppy fields, but I don't think that we're really doing anything to stop the flow of heroin, which comes from poppy, to either us or to the rest of the world. But what's really happening there, and you really kind of hit on it. The bankers in the military-industrial complex are the ones who are really promoting all these perpetual wars, because who makes the most profit out of it? And if you ever really have a question about what's going on, the best thing to do is ask yourself, where's the money? Where's the money? And who's got the money? And where's the money going? And so forth. So if you follow the money, you really kind of know what's going on. And the bankers get rich whether on both sides, because they fund both sides. So no matter who wins or who loses, they're getting their take. And the military-industrial complex is furnishing weapons to both sides, so it doesn't make any difference who wins there. They're going to get theirs. And so the longer they can keep these things going, we'll continue to spend. What are we spending now? Up more than $50 billion a year in Afghanistan? I don't think that's the best use of our funds, to tell you the truth.
Right.
And I heard you. I think as I was listening to the show online, you're kind of wondering where I stand, and I guess I'm kind of nobody can figure out what I am, and I can't figure it out myself, but I think I'm part libertarian, I'm part conservative, and a whole lot constitutionalist, and mostly I'm just anti-political. I just can't stand the political establishment, because I think they don't have we the people's interest at heart.
Right. I mean, we certainly agree on that, and I'm kind of libertarian-esque myself. I have some conservative attitudes on some things. I also have some liberal attitudes on some things, but I do agree with you about the establishment. And what I always say is, we sort of toil in this delusion that we elect these people and send them to Washington, D.C. to represent us, but really they just represent the special interest groups and the lobbyists, and, they represent the military-industrial complex. They represent big tobacco. They represent the banking lobby, they represent private prisons, and on and on and on. But they certainly don't, they don't work for you and me like we like to think that they do. I try to support as many independent candidates as I can, because I think part of the problem is the two-party system. I think we need to break that. But no, I'm with you, and it's very discouraging. And as someone who's, you've been around a long time. You've been here. You're about my dad's age, so you've seen a lot. Do you feel like that specifically has gotten worse over the decades, the corruption and how things really operate, or do you think it's kind of? My theory is it's probably always been that way. There's just more people waking up to it now, but I don't know. I was born in 1972, so you have more insight on this than I do, but. What do you think? I
think it's always been that way, but I think that it's getting worse because there's more money in it right now than ever was before, and that's due to and talk about being a constitutionalist. We've got something called the Federal Reserve, and that, they're all in it for themselves, and everybody says, "Oh, we got to have the Federal Reserve. That's a sacred institution." And I'm thinking, wait a minute, this is just a profit-making organization that's the bankers have put in place to cause inflation and manipulate our money and our currency.
Yeah, I'm no expert in that area, but I do hear people talking about that, and one thing I have learned over the years, just from talking to folks like you and some other people, is, because there is a misconception out there, and I'm sure you run into it all the time, that the Federal Reserve is like an agency of our federal government, because and the name implies that it is, right? So you can understand why people are confused by it. I mean, it's right there in the name, federal, when in reality it's separate. It has autonomy. The president can appoint somebody, and they're confirmed and whatnot, but it's a very strange relationship in a sense, because they do have that autonomy, and I don't think the Fed chairman can the Fed chairman even be fired, or do they have to resign? Right?
They're in there. They can't even be audited. You can't even.
Yeah.
You remember they tried to question him, and he wouldn't even answer their questions or come and meet with them. And really, what they are, they're a central bank. And if you really get in and study all this and find out, exactly how all this came about, they came up with the name, the Federal Reserve System, to make it sound like it was part of the federal government and make it sound like they had reserves for the United States Treasury,
right,
and make it sound like it was a great system that would, help all Americans and help our monetary and currency systems. And that's as far from the truth as possible. And they started this back in 1913, which is probably one of the years that should go down in infamy as far as the United States is concerned, because there were basically three things that happened that year that really turned this country upside down. One was the Federal Reserve, instituting the Federal Reserve. The second one was the implementation of the 16th Amendment, which is the income tax, and the IRS, which we had a very profitable country up until that time, and they said, oh, the income tax will only be 1%. Well, once the government gets involved in something like that, the politicians will just keep working it, right? And then the third thing is they voted the 17th Amendment, which was to take representation away from the states. And the way they did that is by electing senators by popular vote. So now senators are voted on a popularity contest, so they represent whatever special interests they represent, but they don't represent the states anymore, because the House of Representatives was supposed to represent the people. The Senate was supposed to represent the states.
Yeah.
And now the federal government treats the states like they're regional departments, and they've turned the whole thing upside down. So the federal government was on the bottom, the people were on the top. Now the people are on the bottom, and the federal government's on the top.
Well, you mentioned another thing that a lot of people probably don't realize, is that the Senate wasn't always elected, the same way that the House is by the people. If I have it correctly, the senators were originally voted on by the individual legislative bodies in the states, right? The state legislatures, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. I wasn't 100% sure on that. Do you think it's and again, I don't mean to get conspiratorial, but I've always been a little bit fascinated by this. Do you think that it's one of the reasons why there isn't more? I mean, I know Rand Paul has talked about auditing the Federal Reserve, but do you think that there isn't more sort of push against the Federal Reserve because it can be dangerous? I know that that's one of the theories about the JFK assassination, and also too, somebody explained to me once, and I did a little research on it, and it seemed to be legit that Ronald Reagan, prior to the assassination attempt on his life, was very critical of Paul Volcker, who at that time was Fed chairman. And, of course, Paul Volcker shows up in recent history as well. But Reagan was very critical of him. And then after the assassination attempt, Reagan was suddenly very complimentary toward Paul Volcker in public. So, again, I know, not to go down that road, but these thoughts do come into my mind. I mean, do you think it's just, is it dangerous to go after the Federal Reserve?
Absolutely. And you notice that any time there's any conflict with the Fed, that all of a sudden it's all secrecy and nobody knows anything about anything. I mean, that should tell us something. And why can't we find out who murdered JFK? And there's a lot of theory that he was talking about ending the Fed, and all
right.
of a sudden he's assassinated.
Yeah.
And we still don't have an answer for that, and that was in 1963. So that's 56 years ago, 55, 56 years ago.
Yeah.
So. And did you know that the Federal Reserve has its own police force? It's almost like a military organization.
No, but I mean that out of hand doesn't strike me as odd. That they, I mean, is it like their own security? I mean, lots of organizations have their own, sort of security. I mean, unless you're saying it's like a bigger, like an actual, like how much authority does this security force or police force or whatever it is have? I mean, because if it's just
they have as much as say IBM or AT&T or any other big corporation has. But most big corporations or big organizations, they have some sort of a security force. But the security force that the Fed has is more like one on steroids.
Okay, I mean that in and of itself doesn't strike me as too strange, but I hadn't heard anyone bring that up before. So what is tell us about solutions, Bill. I mean, what are we've talked about problems. What are some solutions to all of this, or to anything that we haven't talked about that you want to mention?
No, I love to talk about my book.
Yeah. What?
That's my favorite subject.
Sure.
When I wrote the book, I really started writing it back in the 80s, I guess, and it was mostly because I started working as a work management process consultant, and I was always involved in helping companies solve problems. And I worked for some pretty big clients. Alcoa, U.S. Steel, a lot of mining companies, both above ground, below ground, uranium mining, coal mining, heavy construction, power plants. I've probably been in more than 30 power generation plants, so I've got a pretty good feel about how things work. And what we did is we would look at an organization and we'd try and find out, what are their strong points, what are their weak points, and then make a presentation as to here's what we would do to help you solve the problems you have. And I kept looking at the federal government. I'm thinking, we've got all these problems and nobody's solving them. So I made a list of 30, and I came up with about 35 problems. I thought, okay, that's way too many. And so I started prioritizing them and ranking them and cutting some off. Sure. And I ended up with 20 issues that really the political establishment has really imposed upon us that affect our lives mostly. And then what I did is I approached it from a very common sense point of view. I thought, okay, what's the history of this issue, and what's the background? And I did like a cost-benefit analysis. I did the statistical analysis, root cause analysis, everything you would do in business.
Yeah. And
to come up with a common-sense solution. So, for example, we have a budget, but we really don't have a budget. We haven't had a budget since 2009. Now, most families we would hope would even have a budget. Most companies have a budget.
Yeah.
But here we got a federal government that has that spends somewhere around $4 trillion a year or more, and nobody really knows for sure how much that is.
Sure.
And we haven't had a budget since 2009.
Right. Well, some people say you just print more money.
They use continuing resolutions,
right.
CRs.
Right.
And so that's the way they appropriate money throughout each year, and they just keep doing this. So anytime an issue comes up that one side of the aisle or the other doesn't like, they hold the country hostage and say, well, we're not going to vote for this continuing resolution, which puts the government out of work, right?
Well,
we lay off the government employees.
Yep.
And there's no reason for that. If we had a budget, none of that would ever happen. And so when people say, well, it's Trump's fault, or it's Pelosi's fault, or it's Schumer's fault, or it's McConnell's fault, no, it's the fault of the fact that we haven't got representatives in our government that can actually put together a budget, and we have a will to put together a budget. And they don't want to put together a budget because this way they can spend all the money they want to spend, and nobody knows, because the national debt just keeps growing and growing and growing.
Yeah.
And, we just keep adding trillions on every year.
Not only that, Bill, but it allows them to play this game that you were just talking about, where they take the fact that we don't have a budget, and they take these, this need to do these CRs, and they've weaponized that, and they use it against each other politically, and we end up, being the ones who pay for it every time there's a government shutdown. It costs the economy billions of dollars, and they or trillions, and some of that never gets recovered. And they play the same game with the debt limit or the debt ceiling, spending cap, whatever term you want to use, where they'll say, okay, well, maybe we'll default, and then they play this game of chicken. It's really obscene, and you're right. Everyone's to blame. We elect these people, to represent us, and then they go and they act like infants, and they fight and bicker, and we're the ones paying for it. And then we keep re-electing them, of course.
Absolutely. And I do have a chapter on term limits, and the Founding Fathers actually discussed rotation of authority, which is now we call it term limits. But let me get back to this budget a little bit.
Sure.
So I really studied the budget as best I could, and I did this by going to the .gov websites. And in doing so, I found out that we have more than 2,100 federal agencies and departments. Now, do we really need 2,100 agencies and departments to regulate and control the everyday lives of our citizens? Because that's what the government is doing now. And just about every one's redundant with state agencies. For example, each state has an EPA. The federal government has an EPA. That's just an example.
Right.
So anyway, as I looked at the budget, I thought, there's no way that this budget will ever work, because what they do is they use baseline budgeting, and they say, okay, we'll add 5% or 7% to it every year. And so they just keep going and going, and the people have no idea what's going on as far as the budget is concerned. We just know that they're spending a lot of money, but they tell us that's okay, we need to spend this money, and everything's going to be all right. So I came up with the solution for this, and of course, when I tell people my solution, they say, well, that'll never work, and then until they read the chapter, and when they read the whole chapter, then they'll say, oh, yeah, you nailed it. You know exactly what you're talking about. So anyway, what we have to do with the budget is say, okay, we know our revenues are going to be so much each year. We're going to bring in, say, and I'll just use round numbers. We're going to bring in $4 trillion next year. So then we can budget for $4 trillion. So what we have to do is we do it by percentages. And we say, okay, the military gets X percent, and infrastructure gets X percent, and so forth, and you figure out exactly what percentage each agency or department's going to get. And that way, if the budget ends up more than 100%, the people will know. They say, wait a minute, you're spending 110% of our revenues. That's too much. You can't do that. But see, right now, they can just tell us how much money they're spending, and we have no clue.
Well, I think we've reached a point where, because I'm curious to get your perspective on this. It used to be that, so we have this two-party system, which I think we both agree has a lot of problems. But it used to be, at least the narrative was, right? So you've got the Democrats who just want to spend, and then you've got the Republicans who want some fiscal restraint and who are fiscally conservative. But that seems to have gone now. It's gone out the window publicly, in the sense that during the George W. Bush administration, you had Dick Cheney who publicly said, "No, deficits don't matter," because they wanted to be able to spend however much they needed to spend to do Afghanistan and Iraq, literally off the books. They weren't even including it, in the budget that the budgets that they were proposing. They just said, no, we're not even going to count that. It is what it is. You just put it on the credit card, whatever. But now we're in an era where, and by the way, it's not like that started then. I mean, during the Reagan administration, there was a lot of deficit spending on nukes and all that. So, but it seems like there was a real shift in attitude among conservatives publicly, starting with Dick Cheney's explanation when he had to make the rounds on the Sunday morning talk shows, talking about, well, this is why we're doing it this way. And, don't worry about the money. We can print more and whatnot. That was a real kind of shift in what they would say about it publicly. And now it's like, we just keep cutting taxes, which a lot of people love, and that's fine. But then everyone's so shocked when, the deficit just keeps climbing and climbing and climbing and with no end in sight. And I don't know where all the fiscal conservatives went, but I mean, I had what's his name? I forget his name. I'm blanking on his name. The gentleman who runs the New Hampshire chapter of Americans for Prosperity here. And he said once that actually Bill Clinton was the last fiscally conservative president we had, because we actually had a budget surplus. But then that was the end of fiscal conservatism in America. So it just seems like there are no fiscal conservatives anymore on either side of the aisle. That whole concept has been completely abandoned. Sometimes I wonder if they know something we don't, like maybe there's an asteroid headed for Earth at some point. I mean, I hope not, but at some point in the near future, and everybody just said, don't worry about it. We're not going to tell the public about it, but we can spend whatever, and it just doesn't matter anymore. We don't have to worry about it.
I like your asteroid theory. That's a good one. Anyway, back in the 90s, Newt Gingrich who was Speaker of the House, Republican, and Clinton, they worked out, and we shut down the government, I think, 3 different times with Clinton. Yeah. In the Clinton administration, but they worked it out, and they found a way to be fiscally conservative. Mm-hmm. Now, in my articles, and I hope I don't. I hope I offend a lot of people when I do this, but I have 2 categories. We have the goats and the rhinos, and the goats are GOAT, the goofy Obama adoration team. No matter what happens, those people, they want Obama back in, and they adore Obama. Sure. The rhinos, spelt with an H, the really hypocritical, incompetent, narcissistic Republicans, the Rhinos organization, I guess, is the O for that. Okay. Here's the difference between the two. Yeah. The goats want to expand the welfare system as fast as they can, as much as they can. The Rhinos are very fiscally conservative. They just want to expand the welfare system just incrementally, as gradually as we go along. But eventually, when we all want to get to the same place where, we've got everybody on welfare, and we've become a totally socialistic country.
Yeah, I mean, I see it maybe slightly different, because I think a lot of the rhinos that you talk about, they actually want to cut social services, but they've always got plenty of money for these wonderful wars, and actually, well, you know what? They do want to expand welfare, but they want just a different kind. They want to expand corporate welfare, and they'll pay less and less taxes, but will continue to spend more and more money on war. And But no, but I basically agree. I mean, I maybe disagree on some of the specifics, but I agree with your overall concept. And by the way, I voted for Obama in 2008, but I didn't repeat it again in 2012. But that has to do with, foreign policy and maybe we won't prosecute these bankers who broke the law after all, and privacy issues and those kinds of things. But yeah, I mean, but it is another example ultimately of how both parties just let us down and just kind of like to kick us in the groin. Wow, time is flying by, Bill. Do you have a few more minutes?
Yes.
Okay, I didn't want to keep you if you have because you've been very generous with your time.
I've got all the time you need, Matt.
Okay. Now what else I wanted to ask you, because I wanted to get at least one more of these in from your book, which I do want to read. It sounds very interesting, but what's another example of a problem that you highlight in the book?
Well, let's take education, for example.
Mm-hmm.
In 1979, the United States ranked number one in all test scores in all subjects. And at that time, we decided we needed to have a Department of Education. So we added the Department of Education under Jimmy Carter, signed it into law, and it was supposed to be about a 3,000 person department, and it was supposed to have a budget of about $4 to $5 billion a year.
Mm-hmm.
Now we've got a Department of Education that has more than 50,000 employees. It has a budget of somewhere around $60+ billion. And now our test scores we're in the low 20s and 30s as far as ranking in math and reading and science and so forth.
It's scary.
So my question was, what good did the Department of Education do for us? So then I got looking into it, and my numbers are maybe a little bit, from a year or two, so they could be updated a little bit. But we're spending more than $600 billion a year on education.
Mm-hmm.
Only roughly half of that goes to instruction. The other half goes to bureaucracy. And so I'm thinking, wait a minute.
Doesn't surprise me.
This isn't working very well. And if private schools can operate without government spending, without government revenues, why shouldn't we just privatize all education and let them compete with each other? And I think we'd get students who had a great education, and we wouldn't be wasting $300 billion a year.
I'm partially with you in that I'm a big fan of local control. Get the federal government out of it and allow school systems to have more local control, because the government has a history of initiating these initiatives, these programs like No Child Left Behind, for example, these things that they start and then don't fund, and then it's like, well, what was the point of this? And it just ends up being a waste. I don't particularly want to see, because federal student loans are administered by the Department of Education, and I don't want to see those go away. And from what I've read, and I'm no expert, and full disclosure, I'm terrible at math, so maybe I've misunderstood, but I think those are a net gain for the federal government, even if you you're not technically allowed to default on student loans. I mean, there's some loopholes, but I think the government actually does make a little bit of profit or revenue on that. But and I'm all for encouraging education. So I don't want to see public schools go away, because I think historically that's been one of the factors in terms of moving people out of poverty is public education. So you lose me there. But I do think, like you said, I have no doubt that the Federal Department of Education, that there's a lot of bureaucracy and probably a lot of waste. It's interesting. I always think that, well, one of the arguments that I have with people, because I do take some liberal positions on things, but I also, one of the ways that I am kind of conservative is I do absolutely believe that there's a lot of waste in government and that there's a lot that can be streamlined. And one of the things that kind of drove me out of being a Democrat, because I was a Democrat up until about the mid-2000s, but one of the flaws that I noticed in liberalism, and I think there's a lot of flaws in both liberalism and conservatism, which is one of the reasons why I'm such a square peg. I don't fit anywhere. But one of the flaws I find in liberalism is I think liberals kind of assume that everything the government does, the government's really good at and does efficiently. And, government should do as much as possible. And what I think they don't see is I think a lot of liberals kind of have a blind spot in that they think that the government can do everything better than the private sector. But, waste and bureaucracy, or whatever term you want to use in place of bureaucracy when you're talking about the private sector, is universal. And it happens in companies and it happens in government. And, there's always things that can be streamlined and modernized. And as much as by the way, Bill, I'm curious to see if you agree with me on this. As much as I have always disagreed with Newt Gingrich on a lot of things, and you mentioned him earlier, and that's what reminded me of this while we're talking about waste in government. Because Newt Gingrich is very conservative, and I'm not, so I disagree with him on some things. But one thing I noticed back in 2012, right, last time he ran for president, Newt Gingrich is the only candidate I've heard speak extensively about modernizing government. You'll hear other Republicans talk about cutting waste, cutting bureaucracy out of government. And you won't hear any Democrats talking about that. Al Gore talked about it back in 92, and then I think he was the last Democrat I ever heard talk about it. You'll hear Republicans talk about cutting waste and cutting bureaucracy. But Newt Gingrich, the only candidate I've heard in forever talk about the need to modernize government. And I'll give you an example. There was a story, and this was maybe 10 years ago, but there was a story in the news about the Veterans Administration and how they have a building in Washington, D.C., an archive with all these files, paper files of all these veterans. And part of the reason why a lot of veterans weren't getting the help they needed from the VA was because their files were stuck in this building in Washington, D.C., this 2-story building where they had to actually spend money to reinforce the ceiling because the second floor was caving in because of all these giant stacks of paper, not even in file cabinets. Just giant stacks of paper that were causing the floor to cave in. So they had to reinforce that in an era, Bill, where everybody's walking around with these very powerful computers in our pockets, these smartphones, right? In this era, we still have veterans not getting the help that they need because our government is still using paper files in some giant building in Washington, D.C., where the floor is caving in because there's too much paper. And so I'm curious to get your thoughts on, and I know I kind of went off on a long rant there, Bill, but isn't that part of the problem? Like, what if we modernized everything, brought the federal government into the 21st century, and that would, because here's the thing. I'm going to rant just a tiny bit more, and then I'll let you talk. But here's the thing. Everybody's talking about automation, robotics, and 3D printers, and all of this stuff that is killing jobs, right? And is going to continue to do so. And you can't hold back technology and progress, and I don't think you should. But that goes on everywhere. That goes on in manufacturing. It's going on in the trucking industry. A lot of truckers are going to be out of work because of driverless trucks, right? Where's the one place it never seems to happen? The federal government. They're not modernizing it. They don't care to. Why should they? Right? I mean, these people got to justify their own jobs. They don't want to have to go into the private sector. So isn't that part of the problem? And I'm curious to get your insight on this. And again, I know I went off on a big rant, but you're a problem solver and you're an entrepreneur and you've been analyzing this stuff. Am I right? Is that really part of the problem, that it's not just bureaucracy and waste, it's the lack of modernization?
Yes, Matt, you are not only right, But you just touched a small corner of the problem. Actually, when I wrote my book,
Bill, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here. I couldn't hear you though.
Oh, okay. No, I was just I heard you say when you wrote your book, and then I didn't hear anything.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. Go ahead, Bill.
So when I wrote my book, one of the principles that I kept in my mind as far as my problem solving was concerned is I feel like a small, limited government, limited in power, and close to home is best for we the people, and it should be a streamlined government.
Mm-hmm.
So in helping large corporations streamline their operations, it was incumbent on me to do the same thing in my book. So I have several chapters on exactly how to do that. Now, when you're talking about the archaic way that we're operating the VA, all 2,100 agencies are like that. Matt, would you believe that we don't even have a computer system that talks to each other? For example, we have government employees that take their hard drives out and take it to another department or another building, and they swap them out, or they send disk around because they don't even have the ability to communicate with each other. We're spending billions of dollars a year on the internet and IT for the government, and we're still operating like it was 1990.
Isn't it incredible? And unfortunately, I find it very easy to believe what you just said. I mean, it's shocking in a sense, but it's the government, so why do you agree with my theory about why it is? Just that no one wants to modernize it, because then you start killing those jobs, and then because the bureaucracy has to justify itself, right?
Yes. See, the way I wrote my book so that each one of these issues and each one of these problems that are involved in taxation and education and training and immigration, all these things have to work together, and they're not working together. So there's never been any real there's never really been any push towards or impetus towards getting the government streamlined and getting the government running effectively and efficiently. In fact, the political establishment wants it inefficient, and they want it ineffective because that's how they get money from the lobbyists and keep things going for themselves.
Right. You know what I'm reminded of too is back when I was in high school, I worked at Sears. And, of course, Sears is now, what's really funny? Even in high school, I would hear chatter and whispers about how Sears was in trouble all the way back then. And now, finally, that seems to be, although I guess somebody did sweep in and save them, or at least part of that company. But I remember Sears was looking at changing some things and streamlining some things. And they actually gave out everybody who worked in the office part of the store that I was in, not the sales floor people, which is what I was, but all the people in the office, they gave them these forms, and they were called dumb job forms. And what they wanted all the employees to do was fill out what it is about their jobs, or how the store runs, or anything really, but mostly what is it about their jobs that they think, what are some tasks that they thought were dumb that could be done away with or streamlined in some way. And so everybody had to fill these out and hand them in. And of course they were doing this at every Sears location throughout the country. And there was a sense, though, I mean, people were savvy enough, that there was a sense that, this was a step toward some people being laid off, that by filling out these forms, some of them were kind of sealing their own fate in terms of their jobs, because, where was this going to lead? So I can kind of understand, through just, wanting to, self-preservation, let's put it that way. I can almost kind of understand why some who work in government might not want to see things modernized and streamlined, because they know that, then they're going to be out on their keisters. But
yeah.
Yeah,
and what you experience is exactly what's happening in the federal government. Everybody's protecting their own turf.
Yeah, yeah, of course. Well, Bill, we'll just keep you for a couple more minutes because I do need to get to a break soon because it's the top of the hour. But you did mention you're an entrepreneur. I love talking to entrepreneurs. Just if you can, tell me a little bit about that. Do you have anything you're working on now? Do you currently have a business that you're running, or what are you doing in that lane?
Well, right now my business is being an author and to promote my book and my ideas and so forth. I started writing articles, and I started doing TV shows, and I started doing YouTubes, and I started a newsletter, and so it's all become like my own little business. And I've got a couple of people that volunteers that help me. My son and another guy handle my web page, and I think they've done a great job. I think I have a beautiful web page.
You do?
I don't know,
yeah.
I get a lot of compliments on it anyway.
No, I agree with you. The website is 2020americabook.com. And nope, it's very nice. I like the layout. I'm kind of a website geek, so I look at websites a lot. And nope, I definitely like your site. I think it's excellent, and you can get the book there. And I assume it's available on Amazon and everything too. But you probably prefer people buy it directly through your site, I would think.
Yeah. Let me tell you about Amazon. I had my books on Amazon, and my ebook is still on Amazon, and it's on Barnes & Noble and Books A Million and about 11 other sites, iPhones and so forth. But my print books, it's a hardcover book, Amazon was charging me, and I was like a preferred seller or whatever. They were charging me $45 a month to have my book on the shelves.
Wow.
Then every quarter they charged me somewhere around $195 a quarter for some kind of inventory fees or something like that. So it ended up that I'm spending about $1,000 a year
wow.
to have my books on the shelf, and then people are calling me up or they write me on Facebook or email me and they say, Bill, I bought your book from Amazon, but you didn't sign it. And I said, I know, because I'm not at the Amazon warehouse.
Right.
They said, well, how can we get you to sign your book? I said, mail me your copies. I'll sign it to you, and I'll mail it back to you free of charge. So I thought, why am I spending all this money with Amazon? They only give me a buck or two for every book that I paid for to sell. And so I had them ship them all back to me. I got them all in my storage, and I just take them out and I sign them. I mail them myself, and I write a nice note for everybody. And right now I'm doing a special on Facebook where I'm actually giving the book free if people will just defray the shipping and handling costs, which is $5. I even pay the taxes and the fees and everything on it. So for
wow.
$5 shipping and handling, I'll give you my book free. And Matt, guess what happened when I started doing this?
What's
people
that?
People started getting my book, but they wouldn't send me $5. They'd send me 25 or 50 or 35.
Oh.
One Marine, I was just a Facebook friend, never met him before, sent me $500.
No kidding.
And I called him up and I said, Bob, why did you send me $500? I said, I don't know if I can take this or not. He said, Bill, the work you're doing is so important. I want you to keep it up. This is just a small thing for me to give you this amount of money. And I'm thinking, whoa, this is pretty good.
That's really cool. That's really cool. Well, you should, if you haven't done so already, you should shoot an email to Jeff at Amazon.com and let him know that you don't need his services. You fired.
Yeah, I think Bezos is making enough money as it is, and he was making a lot of it off of independent authors like myself. No wonder he's so rich.
Yeah, no kidding. Richest guy in the world. Yeah. Still, though, you should shoot him an email and just say, hey, Jeff, you're fired. Let him know you fired him. I don't know if he sees those or not. Probably not. But
then they would take my ebook off. My ebook, they don't charge me for it. That's free.
Right. That's still there. Okay, yeah. No, never mind then. Don't do that. That's actually a terrible idea, Bill, that I gave you. Don't take business advice from me. All right. Bill, you've been very generous with your time today. Thank you so much, and we'll definitely have you back in the future if you're game. Maybe we can kind of get you into some kind of regular rotation, especially as things continue to progress or regress or however they go with North Korea. I'm really I do want to get your continued insight on that and other things as well. So I hope you'll join us again in the future.
Matt, thank you so much for having me. I've enjoyed it thoroughly, and I'd be delighted to be back on whenever you need me. Let me know, or have Jenny let me know, and we'll work it out.
All right, you got it. That sounds great to me. All right, thank you so much, Bill. Take care. Have a great day.
Right, bye.
Okay, bye-bye. All right, that was author Bill Muckler, and again, his website is 2020America, 2020AmericaBook.com, and it is a very nice website. So I enjoyed that a lot. Like I said, we agree on some things, disagree on some things, but a really interesting conversation. Wow, we talked for almost an hour. I think it was an interesting conversation, and Bill, he was very patient with me because I went on a couple of rants there. But I, my interview style does tend to be conversational, shall we say? It's not the standard. I ask a question and then the guest answers, and then I ask another question and the guest answers. I like the back and forth, but that was a lot of fun. I enjoyed talking with Bill.
IPMNation.com